Hello, and thank you for joining me for this week's musical devotion. This coming Sunday's lections bring us the story of Jonah's successful remonstrance to the people of Nineveh, who repented and avoided God's wrath, as well as Mark's account of the beginning of Jesus' public ministry. I have some lovely music planned for Sunday, so for this week I wanted to circle back to Monday's federal holiday in commemoration of the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. Since many of these devotions have featured music from the European classical canon, I thought we might enjoy some music from the Black Church this week. I was unfamiliar with gospel music, having grown up in the Catholic Church until I got to college. It was a big deal when, during my time as a student at Westminster Choir College in Princeton, provisions were made for the founding of the school's first gospel choir, the Jubilee Singers. In a place that so heavily favored the European canon, some eyebrows were raised, and I have to confess, in my own ignorance, I wondered what the big deal was. The school was already very much multicultural. Though I recall at the time there were tensions, and in the midst of the national conversation about race that arose in the wake of the George Floyd killing, seeing others talk about those tensions in the first person, particularly knowing many of them through the dubious miracle that is social media, much better now than I did then. And through the lens of my own journey of exploring and attempting to eradicate my own biases and prejudices, it's been quite eye-opening and humbling, and unfortunately the cause for some sorrow. Since we are in the season of Epiphany, of moments of revelation and of God being made manifest, I recall with crystalline clarity the moment I realized it was a big deal for the school to make a much greater effort to celebrate and experience the music of the Black tradition. Now, in those days, they were feeble footsteps, and progress has been made, but there remains much work to do. Attendance at the school's weekly chapel services was mandatory for sacred music majors, of which I was one. Each week, the service would take a different form as a kind of liturgical laboratory. We might offer morning prayer from an English prayer book of the 17th century one week, and we might have a borderline pantheistic service that included howling wolves and a very Franciscan acknowledgement of God's hand in the natural world. I don't recall what year it was, but I remember when a beautiful soul named Deborah Ford was slated to sing in chapel. She was going to be accompanied by Dr. Dumpson, who was the founding director of the Jubilee Singers. I would like to say that chapel services were awash in a spirit of discovery and epiphany, but many weeks they were a room full of nonplussed organists and a smattering of faculty. We'd sing a few hymns. Student organists would play very de rigueur, alternate hymn harmonizations. There was a formulaic quality to it at times. Sometimes students would cajole the pastors of the churches where they were working to come and preach, which in hindsight, in the midst of snobby organists who were orthodox in their liturgical style with a strong, if somewhat judgy, intellectual and theological bent, it must have been quite terrifying for the pastors. But I digress. At their moment in the service, Donald took his place at the piano and Deborah ascended the chancel steps. I hadn't seen her before, despite the fact that she was a graduate of the choir college and was often around Princeton. She turned to face us, and immediately there was this sort of regality about her. I would say that she was a diva in the best possible sense of the word, but she carried herself with a kind of nobility that was fused to extraordinary warmth and vulnerability. I have known only a few people who had anything like her manner or bearing. I must also confess that I was ready not to be impressed. And then I looked into her eyes and saw a glimmer that had me think to myself, uh-oh. Donald played a short introduction and she began to sing. I pause here to observe that we all experience moments of sentimentality and nostalgia that can bring a tear to our eyes. A happy memory, hearing a favorite song at just the right moment, maybe at a concert, or maybe when we remember a loved one who has passed. That is all good and all well. But I have to tell you, the tears that flowed from my eyes at the sound of Deborah's voice were not that. Rather, they rose out of an entire body, entire spirit sensation, a complete yielding of any hope of my own emotional control. Her voice was enormous, it was plush, it was loud. She was operatically trained and could easily crest a full orchestra and chorus. But she also was able to riff in the very best of the blues tradition. Her voice was a rare combination of dexterity and gravity. And when you looked into her soul-revealing eyes and heard that voice, it was, and I don't use this word lightly, entirely overwhelming. The Black British author Zadie Smith wrote a beautiful essay a few years ago on the difference between joy and pleasure. And she defined joy as, quote, a strange admixture of terror, pain, and delight. In describing the joy that had regularly become a part of her life with the birth of her daughter, she reflects that joy is something she must now find some way to live with daily. She writes, "This is a new problem. Until quite recently, I had known joy only 5 times in my life, perhaps 6, and each time tried to forget it soon after it happened, out of the fear that the memory of it would dement and destroy everything else." Now, I recognize that when I heard Deborah sing, what I felt was joy, not a passing fancy, not a brief and discrete moment of delight, but something of an entirely different order of magnitude altogether. After I was able to process what I heard, and after I was able to somewhat regain control of my emotions, I looked forward to her engagements at chapel with the full knowledge that I wouldn't be able to control what I felt when she sang at all, and because I knew it was the occasion for the waterworks. I also learned how very important it was to listen, and to listen for real, not only to the musical and cultural expressions of those who had had very different life experiences than myself, but of the voices of the same, to learn and to do the work of trying to understand. Hearing Deborah sing didn't dement or destroy anything, but it did herald a new horizon of spiritual depth and personal grace that I hadn't even imagined were possible. And it was and remains a standard-setting moment. The last time I heard her sing in person was 24 years ago at a Martin Luther King Jr. Day celebration at the Choir College. I was already out in the big bad world, and Amy was student teaching. But Princeton was only about 50 minutes from where we lived at the time, and we really wanted to be there, so we headed back to school. Deborah sang a beautiful arrangement of the Charles Albert Tindley hymn, Beams of Heaven, with the Jubilee Singers, and it was another one of her reliably transcendent moments. Tindley was a famous pastor and poet in the Black church around the turn of the 20th century. His father, in fact, was a slave, and his mother was free. He was self-taught, and indeed is thought to have taught himself to read. The words of this moving hymn seem tailor-made for a celebration of Dr. King, and it was an absolutely tour de force performance. Here are the words of the 3rd verse. "Burdens now may crush me down, disappointments all around, troubles speak in a mournful sigh, sorrow through a tear-stained eye. There is a world where pleasure reigns, no mourning soul shall roam its plains, and to that land of peace and glory I want to go someday. I do not know how long it will be, nor what the future holds for me, but this I know. If Jesus leads me, I shall be free someday. You can hear much, but not all of the power of Deborah's voice in the recording I've linked below. It's the same piece, recorded a few years later. I wish you could have heard her in person. I wish you could have seen her sing in person. She was extraordinarily breathtaking. There's a moment in the recording at 4 minutes and 50 seconds in where she and another soprano, Laquita Mitchell, who has gone on to an international operatic career, sing in harmony together, unaccompanied, both near the tops of their range. And that was and is one of the most powerful musical moments in my life thus far. When I am feeling down or defeated, I will listen to this recording, and it reliably brings me healing and peace. I really hope it will do the same for you. Sadly, it's not a video, but just an audio recording, but do listen to it. And then watch the second video I've linked. It's Deborah from 4 years ago, singing at a celebration at Trinity Episcopal Cathedral in Trenton, where she was a canon for music. It was recorded just 2 years before she died in October of 2019. She's singing a beautiful gospel song by Mark Condon, and you will get some sense of what an amazing person and musician she was. I'm also including a third link of a beautiful gospel tune if you'd like to have a nice gospel bop around. This one is a rather soulful and infectiously rhythmic Thomas Whitfield tune, Oh, How I Love Jesus, sung again by the Jubilee Singers. I challenge you to be able to sit still while you listen to it. I want to conclude today with a prayer by Dr. King that seems especially appropriate for our moment. And so let us bow our heads for a moment of prayer. God, we thank you for the inspiration of Jesus. Grant that we will love you with all our hearts, souls, and minds, and love our neighbors as we love ourselves, even our enemy neighbors. And we ask you, God, in these days of emotional tension, when the problems of the world are gigantic in extent and chaotic in detail, to be with us in our going out and our coming in our rising up and our lying down, in our moments of joy and in our moments of sorrow, until the day when there shall be no sunset and no dawn. Amen. Please listen to the wonderful music I've linked before. Be safe and be well. I hope to see you online on Sunday. God bless.